Hey, this is Gavin with Hero Looking for Group. I was given a name um, for what I'm trying to do on my channel. It's instead of a podcast, it's called a Godcast. I told my wife, and she didn't seem too impressed, but that's that's the intent. That's the prayer. And I've been doing a video interface correspondence, or VICO, with Gringriz. And I think it's a good way for people to develop relationships, especially introverted people, and people who are not neurotypical. And he mentioned weaponized ignorance, and it reminds me of this phrase called a ignorance policy. Ignorance is ignore, ignorance, to ignore, and there's an infinite amount of sensory inputs that we are ignoring, and there's an infinite amount of potential places to put your attention, to put your focus, and you're ignoring an infinite amount of those. And then if you try to juggle, I could go get my props, juggle. So I can juggle one ball very easily, two balls, it's a little bit more challenging, or three balls, and it becomes more difficult. And so if this is a Godcast, then you can imagine that in your mind there's a limited ability to juggle God with other things. And when you're juggling, you're probably task switching. And so you can practice keeping God in your mind so that it becomes like chewing bubble gum, something like that. And you can always learn how to chew gum better. You can always learn how to walk better. So I imagine meditation would be like trying to make God the primary focus. So like when you're reading, you can't make God your primary focus because you're now doing two things. And I recently heard you only have one language processor. So if you're trying to listen to God, then you can't be talking, and you can't be thinking about words, can't be reading. But the idea that God is love could be helpful. And the fruit of the Holy Spirit are the manifestations of love. And so by noticing these fruit, these emotions, joy, patience, gentleness, kindness, self-control, compassion, humility, by noticing those, or kind of their counterparts, because sometimes those can't exist with some other counterparts like fear, anger, pride, arrogance, impatience, that feeling of rushing. So noticing those can help you, while you're doing your practices, while you're living. So ignorance. So right now I'm kind of ignoring my wife and children and my neighbors, but the hope would be that doing this kind of thing makes me a better at all those things. So I'm a problem solver. And I have an imagination, or God gave me an imagination. God gives me dreams. And so I'll have all of these ideas, and some of those ideas will be offensive. I could name off a few of those, but I won't, because something happens when you become offensive. It's when you become offended, that's you can notice that the Holy Spirit is not there. What emerges when you become offended is a pride. You might even have impatience. You might want to become defensive. And so, because you're trying to protect something that you are attached to, and so it's good to identify the thing that you are attached to and ask if your relationship with that thing is ideal, which it never is, because we're not perfect. And so every time you feel offended, that can be every time you, another way to say it is when you become defensive, um, that is an opportunity to improve toward the ideal. What's funny is I have a lot of ideas. Like, if people learn this way of being with God, then the hope would be that, we would build communities. And I say that and I think about my immediate family. Like, it's like clean your own room. Well, I have a wife and children, and they don't listen to these, but I do I practice bringing this into my relationships. So I'm also not in a rush. But perhaps there's people who are in a different step in their path. Like, I imagine a future step in my path, and there may be people who are already there. It's like maybe your children are out of the house and you have accumulated wealth, And there's a question is like, well, I can't take that wealth with me when I die, and should I, um, where should that wealth go? So like inheritance, I feel like I guess the question is what does the ideal church look like? How does the ideal church um, use resources, the economics of it? What's the ideal way, the ideal economy? And I think it's connected to the family. So I have agency, my wife has agency, and we don't force each other to do things. We serve each other. And then we have children, and we don't want to force them to do things, but sometimes we do. Um, and when we do, there's perhaps an opportunity to to learn how to have done things different so that we didn't need to force anybody to do anything. But when you're dealing with babies exploring their environment that is dangerous, uh, it's your job to make sure they don't have injuries that are going to impact them the rest of their lives. Yeah, you want to avoid long-term damage. That doesn't mean you avoid pain, but it does mean you avoid death, for example. So a church, inside a church, there would be people who have agency, and then there's people who don't have agency. So, and there's this idea that you increase your agency as you increase your responsibility. But then there's also people who, you know, there are people who are dependent on others, and they may be dependent on others their entire life. And so the church needs to take care of those people like a family would. I heard, I think it was Chris Petco, and it may have been Sherry. And this wasn't their last one, but I think they were talking about, and I don't know if it was them, but and I don't think it was Chris, but I think it was Sherry and someone else. It was Jess P. They were talking about the like the child or the son that is living in the parents' basement, and they were being, it seemed like they were being condemning, but each, and I'm just reminded of people who are depend on others. And so this idea that you have to push a child out, um, it reminds me of a survival of the fittest approach. So what you're basically, if you're not careful and you don't have nuance, you're basically saying you'll push them out of the house and they um, may die. And so I think a church or a family is trying their best to increase the person's agency and um, reduce their dependency on others. But I think ultimately we need to learn how to cooperate together. And so, in order for us to accomplish big goals, we do depend on each other. So that's another reason why I don't like this idea of just pushing people out of the home or pushing people out of the church. I'm cool with rules to say this is the rules in this house or in this church, and if you can't do what we ask, then we will kick you out. I'm cool with the rules like that, but they need to be fair rules. It's like an alcoholic. You could provide a place for an alcoholic, and you could say, and I'm thinking of the book that Sherry recommended that basically talked about the Jesus prayer. So this person just learns the Jesus prayer and says it, and carries his small number of possessions, and ends up at a place where they allowed an alcoholic to stay there. But the rule was that the alcoholic could drink as much as they wanted, but would go to bed immediately and would not go out and engage with others when they were drunk. So there are some interesting rules like that. So you don't necessarily say no alcohol. You say if you're going to do it, you're going to do it here at this time and in this way. So, hello, squirrel. I think I see your nuts. All right.